Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Evan Wildstein to talk about his new book, The Nonprofiteer's Fundraising Field Guide. Evan, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I'm curious to know, before we get started, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Superhero origin story. I think you'll probably have a lot of responses that are similar to this, but it was purely accidental. My first role out of undergrad, 20 years ago, this is my 20th year doing this, was in the nonprofit space in arts and culture. Kind of never looked back. I thought at this point in my life, in my early 40s, that I would be a touring rock and roll musician, which some of that serves you well in the social impact sector. But I remember a really frank conversation with my father when I was in a band back in high school and college. And I said, Dad, I'm going to drop out of college because my band is going to make it. And he said, yeah, it definitely will. But why don't you finish up your undergrad just in case it doesn't fall through, in case you're not part of that, 1 or 2% of people that make it through. So I finished undergrad with some semblance of kind of a nonprofit management degree that's centered around arts and culture. I got my first job coordinating a sort of a musical outreach program in the 5 boroughs in New York City, which is where I grew up. And I just haven't looked back since then. So I kind of fell into it. And that's led over 20 years to doing a bunch of different stuff in public programs, operations, fundraising, a little bit of consulting. And I have enjoyed getting to know the different flavors of the nonprofit world, as frustrating as some of them might be.
That's really great that your dad had a backup plan for you, because as much as I would love to hear you rock and roll, it's always good to have, just in case things don't quite go to plan, to know where to go next. So great for him. And thank you again for joining me. I'm curious to know then, you wrote a book, The Nonprofiteer's Fundraising Field Guide. What made you, before we get to the meat of the book itself, I was curious to know what was the motivation behind writing the book?
Yeah. And if you're talking about the book as sort of a tongue tie, I apologize to anyone who has to talk with me about it, because I did pick a bit of a flippily titled book. Not uncommon in the world of, I guess, academia or scholarship. The book is sort of a narrative-based version of my grad school thesis. I've been at this work for about 20 years, and I decided maybe 15 or 16 years in that I always knew I wanted to go back to school. Didn't know it was either going to be an MBA, something very formal like that, or something a bit more theoretical. And I chose a program up in the Pacific Northwest at Gonzaga University. They have one of the nation's probably leading programs on servant leadership as it relates to organizational dynamics and organizational behavior. And I did that program. I centered most of my studies around org leadership through the lens of servant leadership. And as I got near the end of the program, when I started thinking about my thesis and my final culminating grad work, I said, I'm in the nonprofit space. I've been in fundraising for about 9 or 10 years, so about half of my career. And I said, servant leadership, we'll get into this a little bit, it just feels really perfect for fundraisers. And I said, what I should do is focus my thesis on augmenting the research that is out there. Come to find that there really wasn't anything that leaned into using the core traits or behaviors of servant leadership to improve fundraising. There's a lot out there on philanthropy about giving money away, servant leadership as being a core value of donors or corporate social responsibility programs or foundations. But on the side of fundraisers, anyone inside a nonprofit whose work results in net revenue, there wasn't a lot out there. So I wrote this highly academic research thesis. And then one of my mentors in college, who has been sort of a guiding light for me on all this, said, you did a cool thing with this thesis. You could do a couple things with it. You can submit it to a journal. There is, believe it or not, an international journal of servant leadership where I have an article that just published. And he said a few people would read it. Very good. Or you could kind of dream big or do a book or something. And I said, well, kind of always wanted to write a book. So I took the thesis, added about 10,000 words to it, interviewed a bunch of people in the sector whom you and I would be familiar with. And there's the book. I pitched it to a couple publishers, and I was fortunate enough to have one of them also in the Pacific Northwest, Whiff and Stock, pick it up, and it officially comes out June 1st.
if there's any concern about the book title, there shouldn't be any concern about the book title. Rather, it's a very accurate description of what it is. It's probably my own dyslexia that has challenges just reading the words for it. And it is a field guide, which means it's a bit shorter than maybe a novel or whatnot. But the length of a book to me is not about the value. The value is separate than the length of the book, let's say. And this is really jam packed with lots of good value, lots of good thought provoking ideas. But before we get also too far into those details, you use the word servant leadership. And that was the first time we had a conversation. That was a new word for me. And I'm curious to know if you could define it and then mention, why is there a dash between the word servant and leadership?
Yeah. You're not going to get a short answer out of me, which I think is one of the issues with servant leadership in the grand scheme of things. And as it relates to the title of your show, and your not so small hat tip to the Marvel universe, it occurred to me, and this is going to be a really poor comparison, but I think of servant leadership as something like Thanos' Infinity Gauntlet, but like if it were used by someone with good intentions. Or maybe, let's go over to DC. Maybe instead it's more like Batman's utility belt. It's, I tend to think in terms of servant leadership is, or servant leaders do, versus servant leaders are. I think there's sort of a two lanes of thinking about servant leadership, where you've got the group of people who consider themselves servant leaders. They call themselves servant leaders. It's sort of noun based, where what I find to be more practical and useful, which is the sort of tenor of the book, is the verb orientation. Whereas servant leadership is a series of behaviors, paradoxical as they may be, that create environments where people are served to the greatest extent possible. And what's interesting about it, what I've liked about this philosophy as behaviors for a long time, is that it sort of flies in the face of most of the things we have come to know about business and senior management and leadership. It focuses a lot less on authority and where someone sits in the position, the quote unquote big boss in the corner office, and more about this concept of leadership as influence. And we'll get more into, I think, in this chat, a bit more about the core behaviors. But your question about the hyphen, the dash between the two words, I've seen it written multiple ways, but there is something, even though that seems like a small detail, it's a really powerful one. And what I find is that hyphen, or that dash between servant and leader, creates something of a bridge. And thinking in the hyphenated terms suggests something of collaboration, whereas one boosts the greater good by considering the entirety of the orbit. It encourages all around growth rather than what you might think are actions or behaviors that may be self-serving. Because like on one side, service without leadership can lead to what we see a lot in the nonprofit sector, which is just serious burnout and stress. Whereas leadership, absent of the service mindset, sustains that traditional top-down pyramid view where senior manager at the top leads by dictum. Everything else flows down to the bottom, sort of flips those models on their head.
One of the ways I find I can really capture an idea, a new idea, let's say, is through an example. And when I was reading your book, scanning through it, I read a bit of a passage about a gentleman, Bob Galvin. And I was hoping you could just explain a bit about that to give a more concrete example of what a servant leadership is or looks like in the real world.
Yeah. And I found that to be, there's a book written on servant leadership by a couple great authors where they use Bob Galvin, who was, decades ago, the former CEO of Motorola. And there was an experience where one of the employees, they don't get into the book exactly what he did, but there was some sort of glaring error at the time cost the company $100,000, which at the time, $100,000 is a lot now, but back then it was sort of astronomical. And there always tend to be these pivotal moments where, if you come with just the sort of great man, and I'm putting that in air quotes for people who can't see, the great man leadership theories, where people at the top lead by bravado, by do what I say, not necessarily what I do. I think in business terms like that, an employee who made a glaring financial mistake like that would have been let go immediately, would have been used as sort of an example for others to not do what that person did. But there are two core behaviors of servant leadership, one that focuses on conceptualizing the greater good, and another that focuses on healing people in their environments. And what transpired was that Bob Galvin worked with the employee to create solutions to the mistake that the employee did. And over time, it ended up saving the company $1 million. So, he took the very long road there. And that's one of the things. Servant leadership, as I've seen it referred to, is more of a marathon, not a sprint. And so keeping an employee or keeping employees who may have small bouts of failure, who may make mistakes, and looking forward with the greater good, he took a very long road approach. If we fast forward a little bit, there was a great example I saw that wasn't connected directly to servant leadership, but during the pandemic here in Texas, there's a museum over in Austin called the Blanton Museum. And this made a lot of smaller wave headlines in our space where, at a time when organizations were either doing serious furloughs or layoffs, but nonprofit sector let, 2+ million jobs go or furloughed during the pandemic. Leadership at the Blanton Museum took a really interesting approach where they looked around and in a way to stave off furloughs or firings, they took staff like custodians and others and put them to work in other ways. You had custodians writing thank you notes to donors and partners and helping them research people. And I found that to be a really inspiring example of service to the greater good because you were keeping the museum staff employed. You were using them to activate on boosting relationships with donors. And I found that to be a really great modern example of an organization that led by its values.
There was one scenario I read a few years back about being a good boss or a good leader, or the difference between a boss and a leader, where a boss just tells a group what to do and is in front and he's like, leading the charge. Or it was the reverse. They're behind. They were behind telling people what to do. And the foot soldiers were going off into war kind of thing versus their leader is the one in front taking the shots with the front line and leading by example. As I was reading about servant leadership, I was that imagery was kind of brought to the forefront of my thoughts. And I was wanting to know if do you see parallels as well, or is it a bit different from your perspective?
It's a fair question, and I think it's actually a great question. One of the things that you see, not directly correlated to servant leadership, but there's this idea that modeling the way or modeling the behavior you want to see is just authentic and good no matter what you do. And so leading by example, in war, that's very different. You don't want, the general from the ivory tower, as it were, sending soldiers into war when they're not willing to do that themselves. People will follow by example. So if you've got, take it back to our industry. If you've got a CEO who is telling the head of development to go out and raise money, but the CEO themselves is not willing to get out there and meet with donors. It's a little bit less violent than the war analogy. The war analogy makes more visceral sense, but that's the kind of thing where, especially if you've got a young fundraiser or a young program officer who's new to this work, if they can see their executive leadership, board volunteers, and other people who are in positional authority roles doing the work that they should be doing. I remember once when I was working in the arts industry, we had just done a small performance in a community center, and the general director of the opera company, this is someone who's earning big bucks, comes to things you don't expect them to get their hands dirty. We were striking down the scenery. Striking means taking down and putting it back into the touring van. He was folding up the pieces, helping to steam wardrobe from the artists and put them in the crates. You feel a little bit embarrassed because you're like, this is the CEO of the company making drastically more money than everybody else, but they are not in the mezzanine. They're down on the floor modeling good behavior. I think that is the quintessential servant leader.
Yeah, obviously the war imagery is meant to be figurative, not literal, of course. But those are great examples. That gives me a much better starting point to understand what this is about. And I know that you've listed at least 10 characteristics of servant leaders. And I was hoping you can go through maybe a few of them. Maybe you can pick your favorite or the most interesting ones from them. And I don't know if it's better to list all 10 and then you choose the ones you prefer, or just pick the ones you choose and then we'll just list the other ones. I'll leave it up to you.
Sure. And I should sort of a caveat that I think if you were to Google servant leadership or go on LinkedIn and just start following that, what is the pound symbol, the hashtag, shows you my technological comfort, Alex. the servant leader, the list of servant leader qualities or behaviors is probably endless. Like you probably find 1,000 of them. Though I tend to be fairly traditional and not necessarily recreating wheels in sort of a markety way. But what I went off of and what I find that most of the good logical wisdom around servant leadership goes is this list of 10 that was distilled down by the mentor I mentioned earlier. His name is Larry Spears. He's one of my favorite professors in grad school. He is one of the nation's or probably the world's leading experts on servant leadership. He took, and it's helpful, I think, for people to listen to this. So if folks aren't familiar with the name Robert Greenleaf, I think you can't not be familiar with that name and say that you're into servant leadership. So Bob Greenleaf, and if it's okay if I do just a little history lesson here.
Sure.
Robert Greenleaf, from I think the 1920s to 1960s, was sort of an in-house management consultant at AT&T. AT&T, a very different company 100 years ago than it is now. There were no cell phones back then, but his strength was getting the best out of people, and so he took what you could go back to the times of Jesus Christ, if not earlier. You can look at the core behaviors of servant leadership and think this is not something that just came up since the 1960s and 1970s. We've seen evidence of this over time. But what Bob Greenleaf did was in 1970, he wrote this really pivotal essay called The Servant as Leader, which gave this particular practice a name. 50, 100 years before, people were talking about this stuff in organizational theory, but Bob Greenleaf gave it a name. He called this type of person, these types of behaviors, servant leadership. He got this idea, which I think is helpful from noting. He was reading Herman Hesse's book, A Journey to the East. And for those who aren't familiar, I'll give the abridged Cliff's Notes version. There's this group that is on this metaphorical journey to the metaphorical East. He doesn't quite get into who the people are or what is in the East, but they have this servant that is with them on the way. His name is Leo. And what you find over time as the book goes on is that the servant Leo disappears and the group sort of falls apart. So Greenleaf came to this notion that leadership can be present from a servant role. He took that, wrote The Servant as Leader. And in all of his writings, he was writing essays, articles, giving keynotes and other things. After he left AT&T, he was a consultant for nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations. What my mentor, Larry Spears, did was took all of those pivotal writings and tried to find the through lines of what the most consistently written about things were. He found that list totaled 10 things. I'll say them quickly here, and I think a lot of them would make sense for anyone who's in the nonprofit space. And then maybe we could get into like 2 or 3 of them, if that's okay.
That works. Yeah, sure. And just a quick side note. Have you ever noticed that lists are always about like even numbers, like 10 and 5? It's never like 9 or 11.
Yeah.
Odd observation. It's obviously a very well-known, not standard, but it's common. But I just keep on noticing it, and I keep on scratching my head. Why 10? Why not 9 or 11?
There's something. It's like the the outer envelope with a crooked stamp. Like there's something just sort of like off. And I know there's put the stamp on crooked, and it looks like there's an actual human being that put it on. So maybe I should read this. But there's something comforting, I guess, about round numbers. I don't know. 10 just seems overwhelming to me. I remember when I was early conversations about this book before I did it, someone in our sort of collective network said, maybe 10 is a bit much, because what I did was I took all 10 of those servant leader behaviors and I suggest 3 actionable practices you could do for each of them. So the sort of subtitle of the book is 30 Practical Ways to Boost Philanthropy Through Servant Leadership. So if you think 10 is a lot, anyone listening, don't get dissuaded by 30, because the book is only like 80 pages. You'll fly through it, I hope. So the list of 10, as Greenleaf wrote it, as Larry Spears distilled it down, I'll go through these relatively quickly. I'll focus on 2, Alex, and if there's another you want me to chime in on, I'd be happy to. So
yeah, that works.
Listening is the first one. I would say above all else, and here's a quote from Greenleaf, and I'm actually quoting him here. Only a true natural servant automatically responds to any problem by listening first. And it's because listening builds strength in other people. I would say fundamentally, and I think most people in the nonprofit sector and business in general would agree that listening is a quintessential thing. You can't really move anything along if you're not truly, not just hearing what people say, but listening to what they do. Servant leaders are also empathetic. Now I'm going on to the numbers 2 through 10. So servant leaders are empathetic. They lead from a place of healing. They practice persuasion. They possess a tremendous amount of awareness, specifically self-awareness. They have a great deal of foresight. They're able to look forward and see things for what they could be. They conceptualize. This is one that I think nonprofiteers love, is that servant leaders practice stewardship. And stewardship fundamentally is more a matter of trust than anything else. Probably one of my favorites is that servant leaders practice a serious commitment to the growth of other people. And then final on that list of 10 that people wouldn't be surprised about is servant leaders build community. So that's a list of 10. I think anyone listening to this would probably hear that and go, that doesn't that just, if you were doing like a video game, the avatar of a nonprofit employee, I think you would probably plant a lot of those behaviors into the quintessential nonprofit employee, especially a fundraiser. And the note I made earlier about the infinity gauntlet or, Bruce Wayne's utility belt is that servant leadership is often kept at this 10, 20, 30,000 foot view, where I think one of the reasons it's difficult to kind of say what it is because so many people keep the definitions at that very high level. Servant leaders should listen. They should be empathetic. Very few people have drilled into how to listen better, how to practice empathy, how to be someone who leads from a place of healing. That's what I've tried to do in this book. So just sitting on listening as the first big one, I want to go back to that line that only a true natural servant automatically responds to any problem by listening first. For me, this is the big paradox because, I mentioned at the start of this conversation, by this point, I thought I'd be a world famous touring rock and roll musician. I was a lead singer, lead guitarist for a number of bands, very comfortable being in the spotlight, in front of the curtain. Even when I went over to the nonprofit space, the industry I chose was arts and culture. I was producing operas, other performances, introducing them before, doing talkbacks with artists. And so I was someone who, for the entirety of my adult life, I've been very comfortable being in front of the curtain. Listening, if I'm being honest, is not a behavior that I inherently do well. That's something that I've had to struggle with. One of the things that I did a lot during the high days of the pandemic, when everybody was virtual, I kept myself on mute a lot more. I kept a little Post-it note next to my laptop screen with the word listen on it, because I tend to find myself gravitating towards contributing to a conversation instead of listening. There's this sort of 25-75 rule that we talk about in fundraising, where we should speak 25% of the time, and we should allow our donors and philanthropists to speak 75% of the time. And that is super hard math to do in real time. It was easy for me to do in real time because I found that I was talking over people, steamrolling them, cutting them off. And that's not a good behavior. I was not leading from a place of listening. So I've had to really actively practice generative listening. And there are some practical things in the book that I point to, like one of them being that 25-75 rule. If you are on the phone, on a Zoom, sitting across from coffee from someone, and you find yourself just leaning forward, you're cutting the donor off, just pause, sit back, relax your body language. People will speak. And if they don't, it's okay, because that leads to one of the second things that I suggest in the book is what I'm loosely, lovingly calling like the new 5-second rule. Now that we have a kid at home, I'm thinking about the 5-second rule. You drop a pacifier on the ground. We clean them all the time, but you grew up, if something's been on the ground, I don't know if there's any science behind it. If it's there for less than 5 seconds, it's okay. You can eat it. You can do what you want with it. But this idea of when you've prompted a donor with a question, whether or not you're asking them about their family, their business background, or if you're making an ask, if you're asking someone to contribute $5, $10, $25,000+ to the organization. What I find a lot of fundraisers do, and I've done this a lot in my career, where you say, Alex, thanks so much for your time today. I know where we've had a lot of good discussions about the programming that we do. Would you consider $10,000 gift to our organization? 5-second pause between the end of that question and waiting to see what happens with the donor feels like a darn eternity. But you allow a lot of generative space when you can lean into that. I struggle with it so much. And the thing that most people do in that world is they make that question and then they immediately follow up with something like, oh, and I know it's a lot of money. If you can't do it right now, if business is tough, we totally understand. Maybe you could do less. Maybe we could spread those payments out over a couple years. And a lot of decisions get made for donors because fundraisers don't practice active listening, because they don't give themselves those 4 or 5 seconds to lean into that. So listening first and foremost. I think if you do, were Bob Greenleaf still with us, if he would probably say if you do nothing else out of the 10 things that he believed a servant leader does, he would probably say that listening is the baseline practice. How does that sound so far?
Sounds so far so good. The going back to that 75-25% rule, the way that I learned it is through the simple expression of saying you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So you should be listening at least twice as much as you're speaking. So if you can't do the math, then maybe that might help. That's, I guess that's 66-33 kind of thing. But
but again, round numbers, right? That's less sexy than 75-25.
That's true. But 1/3, 2/3. Well, okay. Second thing is the 5-second rule. I did watch a episode of Mythbusters, and they did blow that one up. There is bacteria that is immediately transferred to whatever is fallen. So there is no such thing as a 5-second rule.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm glad we sterilized the pacifiers when they fall on the ground then.
And the third thing is one of the many beautiful things about Japan and Japanese culture is when they're in business meetings and they talk, I don't know if this is true, but they actually wait up to 10 seconds between waiting for the other person to respond, to create space, to create insight, to reflect, and to your point, not to jump over each other in conversation, but to allow the conversation to take its natural course. And not to be just one person contributing after another, but to make it a more meaningful conversation. And I thought that was really beautiful to hear.
There's a lot we can learn and look, I'm thinking of this through the lens of an American. There, even our peers up in Canada, peers south of the border, Europe and Eurasia, there's a lot of research also on servant leadership in different cultures. I think some of this would fly in the face of how other people do it. So anyone listening who English may be your first, second, third, fourth, fifth language, if you can understand what we're talking about here, this is not meant to paint with a very narrow brush. These are broad things that may make sense for folks. So excellent point.
The quote that I liked most when reading the book was, if you're not willing to put everything aside, then you are not willing to truly listen. And I think that's really important, but also hard to do, because as I'm talking, as you're listening, not only are you, of course, listening to the exact words that I'm saying, but you might have some other thoughts going through your head, like, I'm hungry. Geez, I haven't eaten in a while. And you have like secondary thoughts that happen at the same time. So to kind of put that aside during a conversation and to give your full active attention on something is challenging. But if you can reach it, and I know some really great therapists, for example, can do that, it's perceived by the speaker. There's a noticeable difference in the way that people are attentive in part or in full. And to your point, I mean, it's a fundamental trait that really all of us can benefit from learning how to do better.
One of the fascinating things for me where servant leadership sits differently than, there are different theories, great man theory, leader member exchange, authentic leadership, transformational leadership. Servant leadership, it's sort of one of these, it's newer in the canon. Bob Greenleaf wrote his essay in 1970. He wrote a bunch of other stuff, the 70s, 80s. There was Robert Greenleaf's Center for Servant Leadership, which I believe when it was founded was called the Center for Applied Ethics. He should have hired a marketing firm to help him with that name, because it just seems off the bat. But there are so many things that thread through to other things. One of these other traits of servant leadership is empathy. And when you were talking before, just even like body language, thinking of technology, and I think we'll get to that in a second, but thinking of technology and how it, even the smartest of us who think, oh, I can just look down at my Apple Watch or just take a glance at my phone and I can pop right back up to the conversation. I always love to text a few friends when I go to a coffee shop, and like you can always tell the meetings that are fundraiser donor. It's someone who's fairly casually dressed, and then the fundraiser is always in, khaki and in a blazer, and there's always like a body language that you can tell that there's a philanthropic conversation happening there. And the amount of times I can count on multiple fingers that you've got the fundraiser has their phone sitting on the table face up. You may not look at the text message or the email that comes through, but some of the research, and I point to a little of this in the book, that shows that even just a momentary distraction from technology can distract your brain for like 30 seconds. And I compared it to some world famous rock and roll song choruses. So when you think about you're talking with a donor, say it's a cancer survivor, and you're talking about a meaningful gift to the hospital that may have saved his life or treated his wife or something like that. And your phone pops up or your watch vibrates. I don't have an Apple Watch. I don't know if they vibrate. Just, humor me. That's going to pull you away from that conversation. That's not going to allow you to be clear and present. And to the quote that you mentioned, how can you truly listen to anything, let alone if you're barely able to hear what someone says, if your posture, your focus is elsewhere, and if you just don't have the time and space in your own being to do that. It's a good quote you pulled out. Thank you for that. That's the point. You could thread through to all of these, but the one that's sort of my favorite is sort of near the end of the list, but I think if it were anything, I would put it almost as important as listening. And you see this in a lot of senior managers. Doesn't even need to be senior manager, but the thinking of leadership as influence, not positional authority, but the servant leaders that I think do this the best are the people who lead into growing other people and not necessarily always putting other people first. I think that's sort of a reductive misunderstanding of servant leadership, but committing to the growth of other people. There's another quote by Greenleaf, and I love this one because there is this international journal on servant leadership, and this quote by Greenleaf sits on the front page of every issue of that journal because it's so important. He said, "Do those served grow as persons?" And then I'll fast forward a couple lines. And he said, "And what is the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit or at least not be further deprived?" You can commit to the growth of other people as an executive assistant just as meaningfully as you could if you were the CEO or executive director of an organization. And if there were any other trait that I think followed up listening, and that what listening can lead to is this commitment to the growth of other people, because that's holistic. I think one of the misunderstandings of servant leadership, as I said, is that you just give so much of yourself for the benefit of other people. But if other people grow, and I think in terms of staff or donors, if they grow with us and through us, that's a tide that lifts all the boats. And I think, especially in philanthropy, you can commit to growing other people by inviting donors to conversations about programming. There's a great adage: if you ask donors for money, they're probably going to give you advice. And if you ask for advice and guidance, you may end up with a philanthropic conversation. So you can start there. You can grow your staff by leaning into professional development. This doesn't need to cost a whole lot. I think especially in this technological age, you can look at the Lilly School of Philanthropy. You can look at Candid, GuideStar, and other resources. There's a lot of stuff out there that is free. Listen to every episode of this podcast. You have great guests. You're a great host. There's a lot of free stuff out there, but grow your staff by building skills and listening, doing other professional development opportunities, because that increases the capability of people who work for you. They'll have better engagement with donors. Revenue will increase. It's a big cycle. So I think, buy the book and read through the section on the commitment to the growth of other people. But I think equally as important, if not a near second to listening, is that commitment to the growth of other people.
Recently, we had a great guest on that talked about building a great team. And I actually had a few guests like that, but this guy in particular, this individual, was underlying one of his best skills was basically finding amazing people and bringing them onto the team. And he was so egoless. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but his ego was so low and humble. He acknowledged and he realized the value of bringing on these fantastic people and then inspiring them and unleashing them to be able to thrive in their environment. And his whole demeanor toward that was really impressive. And that kind of inspires me or reminds me of this conversation we're having now, where it really is serving other people, serving your team, making them shine. You do get a bit of that glimmer. I guess you kind of hook into that aura a little bit, but the idea is that if they shine really, really bright, it ends up reflecting well on you without you having to get all the attention. And you can really amplify the impact that you have, because obviously one person can inspire and guide many, many people versus, being only one person, you only have so much that one person can reach. So I love the fact that you chose this as a second thing to jump into or dive into.
I think that's beautiful. One of the things that I would say, and I sometimes have a hard time admitting this, but I think, when I was a program director, I was a good program director. Was I amazing? Probably not. Now I've run philanthropic programs for a few organizations now. I'm a good fundraiser, not a fantastic fundraiser. This is a little self-deprecation, but one of the things, and let me harken to our mutual friend Tim Lockey, who introduced us actually for this conversation. I want to say a couple of weeks ago, but with a new baby here, it could have been years ago. My sense of time is a little warped. But in our conversation, he said to me, your superpower, the thing that you really seem to care about is people on your team, staff, and your whole point about the other guests that you had in this conversation is it's a much longer road, but if you can commit to growing the people on your team, so much more will shine through. That's another thing I flipped my script on this maybe about 10 years ago when I first started leaning into servant leadership a lot, but giving things up so other people can grow, it's been hard for me, just considering I'm an Enneagram 8, I'm a confrontationalist. Enneagram 8s, I also learned in researching this book, are people who are just staunch advocates for their people, whether it's romantic partners, family members, team members. They are relentless in making sure that those people are growing. And I think you don't see it a lot in the social impact sector because you have a lot of people who ascend to senior manager roles because they may, and this is something in organizational theory, the Peter Principle, which was also from the 1970s, meant to be sort of a farcical focus that people rise to their level of incompetence. And that's the Lawrence Peter did this in the 1970s, and it kind of explains a lot of the characters in the Dilbert comic series. But you have a lot of people who are like expert program directors, and then they move up to be chief leaders when they have particular functional skills, but not necessarily the people-oriented ones, or really expert major gift officers who are promoted up to be a chief development officer, where you're maybe dealing in principal level gifts, but your primary responsibility is the care and growth of the people who are on your team. And people, leadership, and influence fundamentally different, I find, than operational, strategic, work-related stuff, where you're no longer building the widgets, you're managing and leading and guiding the widget makers. And we don't often see a lot of evidence in our sector of the people who ascend up that ladder in positional authority who are just truly wonderful at the people part of it. But we remember those people, and we would, even if we quit a place, we would come back to another place and work for those people. So you're spot on, your other guest. I'm going to go listen to that episode now.
Yeah, shout out to Tim Lucky for one of his superpowers actually is seeing other people's superpowers of being able to put it into words, articulate it, and then, well, I'm not sure what happens then, but he has that ability to to identify that superpower, which you myself might not be able to recognize. So yeah, and then the Dilbert, I like the Dilbert reference as well. The promotion to incompetence. I see it all the time in the software world where you could be an amazing software developer. So they promote the person to be a manager. And then all of a sudden, all these people skills have to come into play and they don't have those skills. They were just really good developers. So
what I would say is, here's another, this is the thing in like, I don't consider myself an academic, but I do read a lot. There's another great author that some of your listeners may be familiar with, a very modern organizationist, Kim Scott, and her book, Radical Candor, not specifically for the nonprofit industry. And I think the subtitle of her book is like how to be a kick-ass boss without losing your humanity or something like that. So I read books like that all the time, and I try and steal what I can to bring over to the nonprofit sector. She distills down really well this bifurcation of superstars versus rock stars. And superstars are those people, when you look at the sort of upward trajectory, the associate to assistant director to senior director, managing director, and so forth. They, every 2 to 5 years, they've done work that behooves an upward promotion. And what comes with that is more responsibility, more management, higher salary. One of the things we don't really do well, and this is not just nonprofits, I think every business does this, is we don't focus enough on the rock stars, those bedrock people who call it, your database administrator, someone who lives, breathes, knows intimately how to just be a kick-ass CRM manager. Maybe that person 5-10 years down the road doesn't want to be a director of development. Maybe that person wants to own their pocket of work. They want to be a prospect researcher. Maybe they're a major gift officer, and that's what they want to do into their 40s, 50s, 60s. They want to retire a major gift officer. And this is maybe a typically American thing, promoting up as opposed to promoting forward. And I think focusing more on building those people's skills that want to stay at a certain level doesn't mean they can't promote more deeply, where they get better knowledge, they get better pay. This doesn't mean someone who's making $41,000 a year to manage your CRM, which is an abysmal salary, if you're calling that out, that you can't give them more money, can't give them other responsibilities. But it doesn't all need to be upward. Kim Scott does a really great definition of how to work on and encourage both of those folks. But being able to see both of those skills and not just working with people to what the next promotion is. Maybe your manager wants to stay a manager and just be there. Maybe they don't want to be an executive director one day. We as an industry need to focus more on how to be better stewards of those people, because over time, you don't want those people getting stale, because that sort of becomes like mold inside an organization. They get resentful. They see everyone else getting promoted, whether or not they want it. And it's a good thing if we can focus as much on them as we do on those bright, shiny, loud people. And I consider myself a bright, shiny, loud person. So I've had to work at this hard myself.
I love that quote. What we should happen is promote forward, not up, is basically what you were saying. And I haven't heard that before, but it makes total sense to me the minute you said it. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
All right. So that covers 2 of the 10 topics. And I'm looking at the time. We probably don't have time to cover all 10. And plus, we wouldn't want to anyway. We want people to read the book. So I'm curious to know then, from a technology perspective, how does technology fit in with servant leadership? Or how do you apply technology in that kind of space?
Good question. And even as someone who's not great with tech, there's a couple points in the book that I note. If we go back to listening, there's a couple, I think, simple ways. And none of the things that I'm suggesting, like I'm not getting into chat, ABC and the AI and other things like that, but I think there's some like fundamental easy things. On the listening bent, what I've seen, our friends over at We Are for Good, they welcome voicemails and other suggestions for the show through, I think the program they use is called SpeakPipe. But there are simple ways that you can sort of create a virtual suggestion box for people. If you remember, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember growing up in like the early 80s where you'd go to some corner stores and there'd be like boxes in the front where people could input suggestions of their brands or items that you want us to carry. I think there are ways that we can do that technologically, where have comment boxes on your website, in your email footers or headers or whatever. If you really do want people to respond and utilize the technologies that you provide for them, make it easy. In the emails that you send out from your organization, maybe not all of them, but if they're fundraising specific emails, have them come from alex@organization.org as opposed to info@. And make sure that because I can't tell you how many times I've been at an organization where like the communications manager will forward me an email because a donor responded to the email that came from info@the organization. And then 3 months went by and they said, oh, we happened to check the inbox and we found this reply from a donor, because not everyone's up to speed on how to communicate well with technology. Some donors, particularly of a certain age, they see an email and they reply to it, whether or not someone's checking those emails. So make sure that people can reach real people, and you can do that in various ways. If we go over to awareness as a servant leader trait, awareness, I think, is very steeped in the present moment. And one of the ways, especially when you think of the small things we can do over the cadence of time that can get people familiar with our work in such a way that they want to be inspired to donate, is easier for direct service organizations. But if there is opportunity for folks to volunteer, use technology resourcefully. There are programs like All for Good, Idealist, the website, Airtable, and others where you can have donors sign up for volunteer hours, or even just ways to come and engage with your programming. And some of them are far more seamless than others. I know if I can use it, anyone can use it. I'm aging myself here. I'm like a young old person, or an old young person. I forget which way. I don't feel so old in my 40s, but there are a lot of these practical resources out there, many of them that are free, that I would consider technology. I'm one of these people that consider email a technology, even if that's just sort of woven into the fabric of everyday life. But those are just a couple ways that I would think, and I point to those in the book as well.
I'm curious to know, what would be the takeaway? What would you like readers reading the book? If there was like one main theme, one concept that they could take away after reading the book, what would that be?
My baseline, this is the reason I went back to get my master's degree in this particular way. I want nonprofits and I want philanthropy to quote unquote make it. And this is not meant to sound overly negative. I think for me, it's actually largely realistic, but I think the jury is still out on whether nonprofits and philanthropy and fundraising as it is will make it. What I think we've seen a lot of evidence of the past couple of years, especially since 2020 and all the things that have happened since then. We see a lot of people giving themselves permission to proceed away from nonprofit jobs. If you're a major gift officer and you're making the same amount of money with crappier benefits that you could make if you go down the block to, coffee company X and earn less, deal with less stress. Earn, the same, if not more, deal with less stress. And at the end of the day, you can hang up your coffee apron, go home, and work hasn't followed you there. That's important. And I think this is the thing, if you were to think about servant leadership, read this book, enjoy the content, dive into it further, I think that what we might find beyond fundraising alone is that servant leadership creates an opportunity for people to have an open mind and a willing composure. And I feel beyond what I think, I believe and I feel that it just might be the one series of collective practices that can save our industry. And in 80 something pages, I try to distill it down in a way that people understand a little bit better what servant leadership is, where it came from, and how they today, tomorrow, and the next day can go immediately practice the core behaviors of servant leadership to do right by themselves, to do right by their organizations, to make donors feel good. It'll grow, again, that tide that grows the whole. I feel that this is one of those practices that can truly set a poor performing industry in a lot of ways apart and make it better.
Awesome. Where can people find the book as it comes out? You said it's coming out early June. Where can people buy the book? And if they ever wanted to contact you with follow-up questions, what is the best way to reach you?
Sure. Probably easiest place to go is just thenonprofiteers.com. That'll get you right to the landing page for the book. People can go find me, Evan Wildstein, on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to receive emails from everyone at me, M-E, at evanwildstein.com.
Evan, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been very insightful.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.